Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV.
Welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. Back today with us on HFO-TV is Michael Wilkerson, project director and partner at ECONorthwest. Thanks again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We're going to talk today about a report that you guys were commissioned to do regarding housing production in the United States and really kind of focusing on Oregon and Washington. As we all know, politically and kind of the big topic is affordability, lack of supply, and I think you guys have done a great job, as we've had you here before, kind of talking about kind of the economics and the trends, kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit to really see why we are where we are, what policies are doing that are going to affect us of where we're going. So again, thanks for coming, and let's just kind of jump right into this report. Maybe give a little background of why it was done, who it was done for, and kind of go from there.
Sure, yeah, great. So we worked with Up for Growth Coalition, which is a coalition of developers, affordable housing advocates, business leaders, industry, environmental advocacy groups. So kind of bring everyone to the table with the idea that we need to grow the housing supply. I think, there's not a lot of things economists agree on. One of them is that the solution to helping relieve price pressure is to build more units.
Exactly.
Where you build them, how you build them, et cetera. Sure, there's lots of policy options, but broadly speaking, it's let's increase supply. So their kind of top line mission is let's try to educate a broad audience in terms of, why are we not producing as many units? Maybe how many units have we underproduced, and what are some policy options to help stimulate additional unit production in the areas that we needed?
Right.
So the study itself really, I think, starts with the premise that we didn't necessarily coin the term, but I think what you hear oftentimes is we have a shortage of housing. And as an economist, shortage has a very clear and specific meaning. And that's not what's happening in housing. What we have is underproduction. What that means is supply is not keeping up with the demand for units. And for those of you who have taken Economics 101, that just is going to put upward pressure on pricing. So that's what we see happening.
And is there 2 points of demand? I mean, especially because I know we're really focused on the West Coast, Oregon, Washington, and California. Is the demand natural increase in population? Is it the immigration coming from the middle of America, coming out here in combination with the, I guess, what do you want to say, the issues in producing more housing is just kind of a perfect storm?
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I mean, so you have a lot of issues. Fundamentally, the largest driver of demand is household formation. So that's adding new households. So whether that's through in-migration or people moving from urban areas into the cities, whether that's a college graduate moving out of their parents' basement and renting their own unit. So it's really household driven. Other factors certainly play on the demand side, income being the main one. So if households stay the same but income rise, you can still increase demand. But generally speaking, it's just the sheer number of households that are going to drive demand more than anything else.
So we're dealing with this millennial population. I mean, we had the baby boomers and we kind of had the drop, and now we've got this millennial, which is this other bubble of larger population, more households.
Yeah.
And how are we keeping up production, or the lack of production for housing to address the housing needs of this group coming through?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think so that the millennials are now the largest generation, larger than the baby boomers. The most common age in America right now is 25 years old. So if you looked at and you walked down the street and you found someone, they're likely to be a 25-year-old, and they're likely to be living at home. Close to 30% of people under 30 live at home, 18 to 30, or renters. And millennials are starting to now move into home ownership, which I think the myth was that they weren't doing that, and the reason that they weren't doing that was they kind of had delayed household formation. They were graduating later from college, they were getting married later, having kids later. So if you start adding up all those things and controlling for them studies, they behave very similar to other generations. So they just haven't got to that.
And isn't that a normal progression in terms of, you look generational wise, that household formation does happen later and later? So I mean, this is not a unique thing for millennials.
Correct.
Every generation's been doing
it. Yeah.
We just have such a big number now.
Yep.
Combination with the lack of supply being built and the roadblocks to do that, where we've got this critical mass of, we've got a housing shortage or housing underperforming market of deliveries that's causing these issues. For what we deal with on the multifamily side is, we'll say you've got household formations, but they're getting into home ownership later. We're seeing the percentage of home ownership go down. I mean, we've talked to other economists. Are we going to see that kick back up nationally back to 67%? Or are we kind of looking at a generational shift, which again puts more focus on, you still have these group of people, they need to live somewhere. Are we able to produce, especially on the West Coast, enough housing to offset this, like I said, bubble coming through? And it's just, we'll get into this report. It's kind of interesting to see. The policy's been in place for a long time, and we're going to have a lot of ways to try to dig out of this issue.
Yeah, no, I think when you look at, millennials, the homeownership rate for under 35 right now is about 35%. So that's very low. That age cohort has always been lower. The difference is they're about 10% lower now than they were at the peak of the last cycle. So 35-year-olds were at, close to 45%, and the, national average is generally 67, 68%. That age cohort was never that high, but now it's 10% lower than that. So that will be the interesting thing to track, in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, is does that come back up to that 45%? Or is this generation, as many people have kind of posited, different and stay at 35%? So that's, I think, the interesting thing to track. So that's the basic premise of the study. We, certainly feel free to read the study. There's more information in there, but the basic idea is we wanted to create a model that let us understand since 2000 how much underproduction has happened and where. So to do that, we basically built a state-level model. So we have, the U.S., and what we found was 23 states actually underproduced. So what that means for the ones that didn't underproduce is simply, if you look at household formation and income and controlling for some other factors, they're building enough units as they should. In Texas,
or they're losing
population. Yeah, so you could look at Detroit, Cleveland is losing population. You could look at Texas as they're building enough to accommodate the huge growth they're seeing in populations. Either way, they're producing at a level that you would expect to see.
And you're picking 2000 kind of post-financial recovery as the start of we're coming out of it to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think we went back to 1960s with our data to calibrate the model. So the data is very long-term. But when we want to look at, I think the idea was let's capture more like 2 cycles. So we have the up and the down from 2000 to 2007, 2008, and then again, now we're arguably, at the tail end of the cycle, or depending on how close we are, depends on who you ask, but close to a full cycle. So, what we see broadly is many areas produced as many or more than they needed to from 2000, 2008. It's in this more recent 2010 when we started seeing uptick in building again that nobody's really producing. And when you add those 2 cycles together, you see large amounts of underproduction in lots of states. For California leading the way, unsurprisingly, at close to 3.4 million units. Oregon's about 155,000 units. So that's roughly 5.4% of the housing stock. So it's not insignificant. I think in the study, what we want to look at was, you're not going to build 155,000 units in Oregon overnight. That's going to take a long time to scale the sector up, to absorb those units. So we looked at a 20-year time horizon. And the study really focused in on understanding where would you want to build the units? What type of units could you build? Can you build single family? Can you build these missing middle, ADU, duplex apartments that are more affordable, garden-style apartments? Are you building podium product at a higher price point with more density, or are you building towers? And kind of looked at the economic outcomes from those different scenarios. We can talk more about that, but the basic math when we look in the long run, and this data is going back to the 60s, is historically in the US, 1.1 units have been built for every new household. So if 10 new households are formed, there's 11 units sitting out there.
So we've got some equilibrium there where you don't have that pressure where you're...
Yeah, you have some vacancy, you can allow for some demolition or obsolescence of units, but you're building at least as many units as households and a little bit of more cushion. When we look since 2000, that number's dropped below 1. So immediately when you're below 1, you're going to see upward pressure in pricing because there are more households now competing for fewer number of units.
You're not keeping up with demand.
Keeping up with demand.
Basic economics.
Basic economics. So 2010 to 2016, nationally, again, we see this huge difference now where it's 0.7. So for every 10 new households that are formed, only 7 new units were built. So...
And this is national.
This is nationally. And in areas where demand has been much higher, California, Oregon, those ratios are lower. So this is taking into account areas where you have maybe excess units and people are leaving. When you add it all up nationally, in real estate, is a very local market, but it's also a national market, right? So if you're living somewhere, you're looking at your job prospects, the cost of living, et cetera, it's really this kind of national equilibrium that needs to be solved. And then you get into the state micro level, type things. So that's really the nexus of what we're seeing here is we don't need to get much more complicated than that. We can just stop there and say, yeah, we can all agree that if you're not building as many units as there are people being formed, that there's no surprise as to what's going to happen. Vacancy rates
the effects are going to happen.
Yeah, vacancy rates are going to drop. That's a given. And then the question is, how much do prices go up? And that's really where you have income and other demand side indicators driving, how much that is. But certainly the vacancy rate is going to drop.
And then the gist is going to be, what are the policies that are being in place that are going to foster more development, because again, I was just talking to somebody, we're not stopping, especially on the West Coast, immigration to the West. It's not going to happen. I don't see in the short term. but what are the policies in place that are going to allow us to get that number closer to 1? And again, we're so far behind now, it's going to have to be over 1 for a while.
Correct, exactly. So in Oregon, our run rate is something like, in good times, 17,000 units or so. So I think the idea would be you need to get closer to 30,000 units over an extended period of time
to catch up. And
we already see lack of trades out there, and that's driving a lot of the pricing when subs are not able to keep up with the flow of work, and GCs are pricing work accordingly. So we're already kind of at that maximum production level. So to go further is going to take a lot of coordinated policy interventions to say we need to train more people, ramp up this industry, and then through policy say, look, this isn't going to be as cyclical as it's been in the past. Because I think a lot of people who previously worked in the trade said, I know how this game works. Times are very good, and then for 5 years there's nothing going on. So if we can smooth out the cyclicality of the industry, I think you'd see a lot more consistent employment and ability for growth, and that's just going to take some time.
Now, has this message been brought to City of Portland, State of Oregon, I'm sure in California as well? I mean, what is the reception? How do you guys see that moving forward?
So the Up for Growth Coalition is national, and there are local chapters of that coalition, but this conversation is being spread pretty widely, and I think that's the benefit of having a broad coalition of advocates at the table. Is this is getting its way to state legislators, individual cities. Certainly Metro Portland is aware of all of these things when we've had those conversations, because if you can distill it down to something that's really simple, I think that's a lot easier than trying to describe a complex equation of how a development agreement happens, right? Your sources and uses of capital and your yields you're solving for and all these factors, you're going to lose people real quickly. And we have those conversations as well, but if you can boil it down to simply more people are forming households than units that we're building to the tune of 7 versus 10, they get that. That resonates. Right. And then the question then becomes quickly, okay, what can we do about it? So the questions that we've had from state legislators are, where is this problem? Is it just a Portland problem? And I think the answer is yes, the problem is certainly worse in the Portland Metro, but it's really statewide. So you look at this ratio of 1.1 being this kind of magical equilibrium number, and there are a few counties in Oregon that are doing that, but those are the low population area counties, and a lot of that would be secondary homes or population really not growing that quickly in those counties. So some of that is actually population declining in combination with very little housing gets you in the ratio you need.
So they'll get you the number you need to get.
But if you're looking in Bend, you're at 0.7, 0.8. You're in Portland, you're at 0.7 or 0.5. Lynn, Benton, Eugene, Salem, all in there, 0.3, 0.4. So it's, really bad actually in Willamette Valley. Portland region, you're seeing some of that, but, if you're only building 6 in Multnomah County for every 10 new households, that's much worse than a national average.
Got it.
So I think the question then is, okay, this is not just a rural problem or an urban problem, it's both. And the policies that you would need to address those are very different. So I think in urban context, you're talking about, are we limited by density? Are there areas where we would want to build more and we can't by entitlements or other factors? And in a rural context, it's generally not density they're looking for, it's other factors. And generally that's the cost versus the valuation side of things. And that costs are being driven by the high cost areas of the state, and we see this in Seattle and in California, the same thing. It's a challenge to build a product that is affordable anywhere in the state because it's the same cost as it is everywhere else. And incomes are a lot lower.
It's not any cheaper to build outside of the city of Portland. But again, your costs have got to be lower, so it's just a lack of being able to bring supply into that market.
Yep, exactly. So really the study I think is twofold. One, let's get a number out there that we can all center around and talk and understand that, yes, this is a problem, it's affecting many areas. Once you're there, the question then is, well, what do you do about that? And so the study really wanted to understand if we continue doing more of the same. So we keep growing in the areas that we're growing. So Portland, has less sprawl than other areas, but certainly we're growing outwards. Right. Versus denser areas. So we can take this national study and say, let's just keep doing what we're doing. And nationally, what that basically works out to be is in these 23 states, you'd be adding like 54% single family homes. You'd be adding some medium density, some garden style apartments, podium, and very little high density. The study looks at saying, okay, if we can figure out where can we add more density in a way that's going to be delivering cost effective units. So you have some high density, so 30%. So you're building towers in Seattle, downtown Portland, LA, San Francisco, but in other markets you're building, podiums. And the idea is we want to leverage existing infrastructure. So when you're building an incremental unit, you're not having to put in road, sewer, transit. You're saying, I have it here, I have a vacant or an underutilized block.
So let's just add some more density in that
Let's
spot.
make the next unit there fiscally net positive for a jurisdiction. Right. So they're just taking the value from the property and not really increasing their cost structure for doing so. So that's really the concept, and we looked at that from an environmental standpoint. So you get benefits like reduced vehicle miles traveled, VMT. When you're putting people closer to their jobs, closer to transit, you're going to reduce VMT. So we looked at that in Oregon, and what we're basically seeing is a smart growth versus the more of the same. So same number of units, you're going to build 155,000 units over 20 years. What does that mean for VMT? And we see something like a 35% reduction in vehicle miles traveled using a smart growth by putting the units
more higher density
in areas
more medium
where
density locations.
Yep,
right.
Exactly. So
Okay.
that's really the kind of high-level findings from the study. As an example of why we think this can work is we look at California, and this is all 700 or so stations in the state of California. And what we see is the average density within a quarter mile of a transit, so BART in San Francisco, LA Metro, et cetera, is 6 units per acre. Think about that for a moment. 6 units per acre. That's essentially single-family homes, yep. Maybe a very low density. And you see there are some examples of 20, 30, 40, 50, 70 units per acre, and that's per gross acre. So not including
because
roads,
they've got other
yeah.
uses around the transit. So it's
it's parking lots.
Yeah.
It's it's malls.
Yeah.
It's some employment centers. But the idea is that we can focus on these areas as kind of low-hanging fruit. And if we can get from 6 to 30, that can accommodate all the growth we need right there without having to go out and continue to build out in further communities. So
okay.
Certainly not all of the units are going to be there, but the capacity to absorb all of the units is there. And I think that's the main thing we want to understand.
Okay.
So, so leveraging transit density, I think, or transit to achieve density is something that Portland's been very successful at doing.
Right.
We've done many studies at ECONorthwest for various jurisdictions, and this is a little bit out of date, but the data still holds. As we've seen, the dots there on the map are, where units have happened, and we see 40% of all units since 2007 have been built within a quarter mile of a station. So that's very, very walkable. When we look at price impacts, so lots of literature out there looking at being close to amenities and transportation generates higher prices and higher rents. We see that premium go out to, for max, about a mile or a mile and a quarter.
Okay.
So the fact that 40% are within that quarter mile, if you go out to a mile, mile and a quarter, you think we're seeing, more like 2/3 or 3/4 of the units are in that.
Within that scope.
That scope of where we're seeing some benefit from that. So one particular example of a study that we did was through the lens of, in Gresham, if they're looking at putting bus rapid transit out there, is that going to accelerate the pace of rent increases and look at displacing communities that currently live there? And so they wanted to understand in advance what the risk of that might be so they could think about ways to mitigate that.
Right.
And in Gresham, we've seen very few apartments delivered in even the last cycle and certainly this cycle. So 1 unit per 430 residents of Gresham versus when we look at the entire metro, it's 3 times that at 1 for every 127 people. So you're not building a lot of units out in Gresham. So that alone is going to tell you why rents are going up there.
Right.
But more so, it's about understanding the communities that might be at risk for displacement and what impact transit would have on changing the rate that displacement is happening. So in that study, we really went back to, I'll skip through the streetcar, 1990, and said, let's look at Portland circa 1990, before Portlandia, before all of these 20,000 plus apartment units that we've seen delivered in these last couple cycles to back what it used to be, and look at communities that are at risk of displacement. So this is really looking at communities of color, income levels, education levels, and tenure. So are you a renter or an owner? And understanding that those are kind of the 4 maybe drivers
for the risk of displacement.
And so where are we seeing those communities live in 1990? And it's a small pocket in Gresham, a very small pocket, Hillsborough, Beaverton, but primarily in Northeast and North Portland is kind of where those communities lived. Right. And when we start looking over time, and again, this is before most of the max was built, right? This is before all this new development happened. We can already see from 1990 to 2000, there's starting to be a shift. and it's moving eastward, and it's concentrating more in Beaverton and Hillsborough, and certainly moving east of 205.
Right, and moving out kind of that whole North Portland corridor, you're seeing it more and more going out. Yes.
So it's vacating out of
Inner Northeast.
Yep, and moving east. So in 2010 already, you can see, most of Gresham now is at risk of displacement. Most of eastern Portland and, a lot of Beaverton and a lot of Hillsborough are at risk. And what that basically means is that it's not different people, it's the same people, but they've already started to see displacement. So this has been happening going back 30
years. Well, as we talked about before, when you see gentrification or, building coming up in a neighborhood, as you said, the gentrification has already happened. I mean, that's kind of like the last sign that area has kind of gone through this process. And I think a lot of people have a disconnect of, I see this happening in my neighborhood. Like, no, it's been happening for a while. You wouldn't see this development on Division if we already didn't have the gentrification beforehand. So saying the building is what's causing that, I think it's a little, again, it's a disconnect in trying to educate people like, no, that's the kind of byproduct after you've already had this effect.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, lenders are very risk averse. They don't want to take a risk that, I think if I built a brand new building here, 5 years from now, we're going to see rents going up. Not interested. They want to demonstrate today that A, rents are going up, B, that people are moving into that area, and that most importantly, C, rents already are at a level that's high enough to support the math that they ultimately need to attract capital to that project. So when all of those things have happened, you have already been seeing that neighborhood change over a course of decades, generally, before that happens. This isn't something that happens overnight. The tail end of it, you see as visually, you see that change happen in a very concrete way, and you equate that with what's already been happening for a long period of time. Now, I think the important thing that we want to understand when we're looking at policies is, sure, that's been happening for a long time, but what impact does that incremental new development have on these existing communities who are already living there?
Got it.
So that was the main point of what we wanted to look at in Gresham. And so what we found was, three things. One, new construction comes in at a premium. So anytime you have a new building, no matter where you build it, it's generally going to be 30% average rent higher than the rest of the region, than the existing stock. So it's already coming in at a higher price point. The second thing, which we already know from the literature and we verified in Portland, was the closer you are to public transportation, the higher the value premium. So we can see, within a quarter mile, you're getting value premiums. We've seen that with the streetcar, we've seen that with the MAX. And as you move further and further away, for streetcar, it's maybe more like half a mile. People aren't willing to walk as far to get to streetcar. Certainly doesn't go as far, doesn't move as fast, but for the MAX, you'd be willing to walk or bike or take another mode of transportation for a mile or more to get there, and that has some value to you. So that's the second thing. But I think the most important thing was we want to look at existing buildings and see what the rents in those buildings do before and after, and compare that to a counterfactual. And the counterfactual can be nearby communities that don't have light rail or the broader market as a whole. When we do that, we don't really see that those units are going up more quickly, again, because they already probably were going up very quickly prior to the implementation of the transit.
Got it. Okay.
So I think it's worth studying more. That was a small part of a larger study, and I think doing more work to verify that with more robust modeling makes sense now that we've had additional lines built down to Milwaukee, et cetera. We can better validate that's happening. But I think that's a valid concern and worth studying. But when we see that, preliminarily, we don't see a lot of evidence that public transportation alone is causing any neighborhoods to change.
Got it. Okay.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.